And we bound and we bend from the beginning of the world till the never end. O Devo Shalom Aleinu, O Devo Shalom Aleinu, Devo Shalom Aleinu ve'al kul. Mazel tov, everybody! We're having a baby. Congratulations. Let's learn what the Jewish community does when a baby is coming. First thing is what everybody does. Try not to panic. Okay? Number two is, and this is crucial, is picking a Hebrew name. As you may know, besides the secular name that a child gets in Jewish tradition, we usually pick a Hebrew name, sometimes a Yiddish name. Still, in at least Eastern European culture, there's Ashkenazi Jews. Those are mostly Eastern and Western, actually, Eastern and Western European background, and usually naming the baby after someone who died. And Sephardic Jews will still name the child after someone who's still alive. Let me give you a couple of examples. So. I guess I'll start with my name. My name is Neil, but the N sound was taken from my grandfather's Hebrew name, my maternal grandfather's Hebrew name. His name was Nehemiah or Nehemiah, the book of, as you know, the Nehemiah the prophet. So I am named after Nehemiah, Nehemiah, in English and in Hebrew. So I got his Hebrew name. And if I was going to be a girl, they were going to name me Naomi. And in English, which is also a Hebrew name. So they named me Neil in English. And Seth, I think, I don't know who that was after. I'll have to try and find out. That's my middle name. Okay. Let's do my son next. So my son, we were looking for an H name because my wife had Grandpa Harry, who was very, very dear to her. And so she didn't like any of the kind of the regular H names, Harry being one of them, Henry, Horatio. We thought since we have a hyphenated last name, Comess-Daniels, we could do a hyphenated first name like Humpty Dumpty or something, Humpty Dumpty Comess-Daniels, but that we put that aside. And the wife of a colleague of mine suggested Hart, which my wife fell in love with because she knew a Hart in high school. And so we used Hart, and then in English, in Hebrew, we also used her Grandpa Harry's name, which was really a Yiddish name, which was Hersh. And Hersh means the same thing, actually, serendipitously, that Hart does. It means a young male deer. So that was very nice. His middle name is Gabriel. We took the letter G, and Gavriel, by the way, as you could probably know, is an angel in the Bible. So we used the Hebrew name as well as English. And that was after actually a woman who came into my wife's household when she was very young, when her mom unfortunately got sick with cancer, and which she survived, but this woman became like another mother for her, and her name was Gladys. So now let's move to my daughter, which is a very interesting pattern that we had to take. So my wife was in an exercise class with a bunch of, it was a baby and me exercise class, and so she was with somebody, and that person's, they introduced her daughter, and her name was Eden, and my wife said, that is the most beautiful little girl's name I've ever heard. If I have a daughter, I want to name her Eden. And then she went, oi, because that would mean that her grandmother Elsie would have to die before um, uh, the baby was born. And what was interesting about it is, so this is how strict this custom is with some people. It's considered incredibly unlucky with Ashkenazi Jews to name a baby after someone who's still alive, even if they are feeble, maybe even on their deathbed. No, you don't do it because it's like a death wish for them. And naturally, Elsie did die, and so we named her Eden. Um, and her middle name is interesting. My wife's name is Toby. It's interesting. Please, if you want to psychoanalyze this, you're welcome to. My mother's name was Toby also. Okay, the commentators can now go wild. Um, my father's name was Jack, and yes, I was raised by Jack Daniels. So there's a whole other thing that you could go into. I better not run for office because of both of those things. But at any rate, there is no J in Hebrew. J usually comes out like Jacob, for instance, is Yaakov, right? So Jack would be Yaakov, and that was indeed his Hebrew name. My mother's name was Tova, which means goodness. And so we took the J and the T in English, pardon me, and made it Yonit, which and in English Juliet, Yonit is a little dove, and it works out perfectly. So we had the J and the T, or the Y and the T, and so both of our kids are named after people who they didn't know, but they remember through their names. And it's a beautiful, beautiful thing. It's a beautiful custom. All right, there are, you may have heard this phrase, Kain Ayin Hara, in Yiddish. Remember, what Yiddish does is it puts Hebrew in a vice and crunches it. So it comes out Kinahora or Kanenahora in Yiddish, literally against the evil eye. I believe we talked about this when we talked about the ritual at the end of Shabbat, which is Havdalah, that the reason that we don't blow out the candle with its many wicks is because it makes this huge amount of smoke. People in the Middle Ages, both Jews and Christians and Muslims, had a lot of superstitions running around. And so there were many, many things that people did to avert or to shoo away the evil eye. So one is spitting, that they'd say, and we're going to have the baby on October 8th, like that. Because the evil eye will get attracted to the positive statement, but you can negate it by doing something disgusting. So again, that's a tradition. It's also a pretty firm tradition not to set up the baby's room before the baby is born. And that being the result of centuries of Jewish experience and knowing that things don't always turn out wonderfully. And so just in case that happens, you don't set up the baby's room. And now in today's age, with amniocentesis and so on and so forth, or, with scans and so on and so forth, people try not to find out what the baby's gender is. It can help you with the colors of the room, but it's, again, considered to be, by some people, very unlucky to find out any of that information. Good, let's keep going. Brit Milah is something that you heard of, or bris, right? In Yiddish, this word gets condensed into bris, so that and if you remember in Ashkenazic Hebrew or in Yiddish, these T sounds become S's. So you may have heard of a bris, but bris means brit. I mean, it means covenant. Brit means covenant. Milah is the word for circumcision. So it literally means the covenant of circumcision. And as you may remember in chapter 8, I think, of Genesis, Abraham gets called by God to circumcise his son Isaac. You may remember that he already has an older son uh, through Hagar, Sarah's concubine, Sarah's handmaid, excuse me, and she becomes a momentary concubine for Abraham because Sarah was barren at the time. And Abraham has a child with Hagar, who becomes the parent figure of the Muslim people. But and he's 13 or so when Isaac is born, when his little half brother is born. And you may know that in some places in the world, Muslims still circumcise at 13. Quite a bit different than circumcising on the 8th day, which is what we do with a little boy. Now, some people say, well, why the 8th day? And honestly, it's one of those things that's not explained in the Torah. As we did last week when you saw all those commentaries around passages, they exist that way around Torah passages as well. And when the rabbis discussed this 8th day, one of the things that is prominent amongst the commentators is that it's 1 week plus 1 day, meaning the child will have gone through a Shabbat in at this point his life before the circumcision. It is also clear that somehow even in the ancient world they knew something about the development of young children. If you wait too long for the circumcision, the nervous system, the central nervous system, is more fully developed, and they're really going to feel a lot of pain, mostly on the day of the Brit Milah, the circumcision. They don't feel any of that. They really get upset because they're being held in place. We'll talk about that with the next slide. So the person who does the circumcising is a specialist, for lack of a better word. They are not medical professionals necessarily. It can be something that is handed down from father to son. In the Orthodox community, most of these people are definitely not medical professionals of any kind. They don't necessarily have to be a rabbi. This is all they do. This is all they do. In the contemporary Jewish movements, like mine, the Reformed Jewish movement, every single one of the people that I know of who's a trained mohel or mohelet. Mohela is for a woman, by the way. So the mohel is for a woman, for the man. Oh, in Yiddish, this becomes moil. And but they're all medical professionals, anywhere from a doctor to a can be a nurse practitioner or a physician's assistant. I've even on the list there have been midwives also who have been trained as mohelet in that case. And again, this is all they do. The Orthodox Moalim, the circumcisers, will not use any kind of anesthetic besides giving the baby a little taste of wine. Actually, they do more than a taste. They usually take some gauze and put it in the sweet wine that we use and just kind of keep it in the baby's mouth. And to be honest, it doesn't take very much sweet wine to get a little baby of 8 days old very comfortable. But they still can get upset by being held. Usually these days it's sort of on, it looks like a baby carrier without the handle, right? There's a nice little dip in it for their tush. And there's little places for Velcro to hold their feet and hands so that they don't move while the circumcision is happening. And as you know, the ritual circumcision removes the foreskin, and even though and you also probably know that the medical community is split right down the middle as to whether or not it has any medical efficacy or not. But most Jewish people still do it. Some will do it merely medicinally in the hospital. Some will have a rabbi accompany the medicinal procedure in the hospital so the blessings are said at the right time. Sometimes it will be a moil in the hospital, but traditionally the circumcision happens at home. The baby's already home after 8 days, so it usually happens at home. In fact, which actually may be safer because there's all kinds of germs running around a hospital. And in fact, the first circumcision at which I officiated had to be delayed because they did a medical circumcision in the hospital and the little one got a staph infection. So at any rate, we did a naming ceremony later. My son was circumcised in the doctor's office, which was not too far from the hospital, just in case it turned out that there was bleeding in our family or something, which there wasn't, and he was fine. The Kvater and the Kvaterin are the godfather and godmother. There really is that role within Judaism. It can be official or unofficial. Sometimes people do actually designate godparents to step in just in case parents are no longer in this life. So it's a beautiful thing. They carry the baby into the ceremony and then hand the baby to them. Actually, first they're going to hand the baby to, that's somebody who wasn't on the list. They hand the baby to the grandparents. Usually there's kind of a row of chairs, and if fortune has it, there are 4 grandparents, or if there's a more of a mixed household, there can be more grandparents. Each grandparent sits in a line. This is true for a Reform ceremony. Orthodox, it would only be the men. And we hand the baby one to another. It's also a very nice time for the grandparents to have a little blessing, say a little something for the baby. And the last chair is empty, and that is the chair for Elijah the prophet. Now, Elijah, in our tradition, is the precursor to the Messiah, because Elijah, as you may know from your Bible study, flew off to heaven in a chariot of fire, meaning he did not die. And so he is up in heaven, metaphorically speaking, with God and with the Messiah in wait. And but he also spends some time up there, but he spends some time, amidst us. And the tradition has it that Elijah is, the most smelly, crazy, difficult, vagabond, homeless person that you could see. And all Elijah is waiting for is a little bit of human kindness for the road to be open for the Messiah to come. And again, that's our tradition. That's our messianic tradition. And there's more to it, but we'll talk about that. Sometime we talk about the Messiah. The sandak is the person who traditionally in an Orthodox ceremony will literally hold the baby while the baby's being circumcised. I don't envy any of those people. Usually a grandparent. By the way, the positioned profession of a mohel, mohelet, moil, came into being because literally the father is supposed to circumcise the son, just like Abraham did with Isaac and Ishmael. But most parents, most fathers don't want to do that. I certainly didn't. And so you literally, take the knife, the tool that the Moel uses, it's basically a scalpel, and hand it to, you hand it to the Moel and they become a surrogate for you. So good. And the circumcision, by the way, takes place very, very, very quickly. When I did have a father circumcised his own son, it was a twins, a boy and a girl. This father was a physician, a young physician. He was a resident at the time, and he said, "I'm going to circumcise my own son." That was the slowest, most difficult circumcision I ever witnessed. I mean, the gentleman, the dad, broke out in a cold sweat. I mean, he had to stop and wipe his brow several times. He was having such a hard time, which is why it's good to turn it over, I think, to a professional. Good. Okay. Now, what about a little girl? There is no surgery for little girls. And so there's nothing mentioned about an 8-day requirement. I encourage people to try and name a little girl on the 8th day. Most people will wait for about a month or so before they do that. And traditionally, that is not done with a party with the parents and the baby. The baby's not even there. The grandfather traditionally comes to the synagogue on a Saturday morning, alerting the people on the bima, the people on the podium, that he would like a blessing for his new daughter, and so he will get called up for the Torah reading. Now, the Torah reading, which we've talked about a little bit before, the one that's done every single week, right, split up into about 52 sections, making a whole Torah. We invite that person up for what's called an aliyah, meaning a going up. He comes up to the podium, which in our case is called the bima, and he will say blessings before and after a little bit of the Torah for that day is read. It's split up into 7 portions. And so this grandfather will be called up. After he does the second blessing, the rabbi or one of the people leading the service will step in. Rabbi Cantor, doesn't have to be, somebody else who's knowledgeable in the congregation can do this too, and we'll do a very quick blessing for this little girl. In Reform Judaism, we have a home ceremony that is the same thing as we would do for a little boy, except without the surgery. Up until now, it's been called a Brit Chaim, literally the covenant of life. In other words, again, this word bris or brit is covenant. Covenant of life is nice. Simchat bat, the joy of a daughter, also another name for that. But why not go the whole distance and call it Brit Labat, literally the covenant for a daughter? I can't think of any reason why not, which is, again, why I encourage the naming on the 8th day for a little girl, just like it would be for a boy. Now, I wanted to kind of go through very quickly the ceremony so that you could see, sort of what we do. So, Baruch haba literally means blessed is the one who enters. Blessed is the one who enters. And we all say that together. Now, that happens, if you remember, the kvater and the kvaterin, again, within Orthodoxy, it's only a kvater, a godfather, not in the Italian sense, right? But in this sense, the godparents bring in the baby. And so we all say Baruch haba together. And then this is basically taken from the Reform liturgy, although you can see, my kind of updating for it, which I am wont to do. And then it is not uncommon for a ceremony like this to have the lighting of Shabbat candles, but not not for the purpose of Shabbat, unless it's occurring on Shabbat. And then if it is occurring on Shabbat, you wouldn't light those candles, and I'll tell you why in a second. Um, uh, the mother kindles a light, takes her son, and says, this is, whoops, I have to stop clicking. Um, she says this from the Proverbs. I believe it's the Proverbs. And then this is the blessing that she says: "We acknowledge the unity of all things, as it's expressed in light. Joyfully I bring our son into the covenant of the Jewish people, a covenant with God, with Torah, and with our community." It's interesting because I think I told you this story, but I'll remind you really quickly that a mixed background couple came to me. She was Jewish, he was Catholic. They were about to have a little girl, and they asked if I would do the naming ceremony if, in addition, they were going to have a christening at St. Monica's Church. And I said, well, whichever ceremony comes last, that's what the baby's going to be, because each one of these things is a conversion ceremony. And they said, that's really interesting, because Father Torgerson said the same thing. I think it's and in that christening ceremony, the child is made a member of the church. I would assume, Pastor, that it's similar in the Lutheran ceremony. You'll tell me in a minute. I am cautionary about assuming that the child is an 8-day-old baby, or even a little older, is in a covenant with God. Maybe through their family, through their children, but I always want to make sure that it's clear to people that everybody should develop their own covenant with God. That has to be something that's individual. This is the blessing. By the way, the father will do this as well. Same blessing. Okay, same blessing. And then we all say Shehechianu, which is the blessing that we say when something is new, and obviously this baby is new, and there it is in its full form. We are in awe and wonder before and within the holy oneness of being. That unity is the core of all life. From the unity of all, we harvest our sustenance. As part of the unity, we are able to delight in wonderful moments like this. And then I keep going, from Psalms, and then explaining the covenant, et cetera, and then a little wine, or grape juice, depending upon what works for an individual family. And I always recommend white wine, just in case we spill. And then the naming itself occurs. But before we do this, let me tell you that what I usually do at this juncture is I stop and I'll talk to the baby. Well, really, I'm talking to everybody there. And I'll, in the days before COVID and in post-COVID, I will do, I take a little hand of the baby and I say, this hand represents you as a human being. And then another hand, and this hand represents you as a little man or a little woman. And then a foot, and I'll say, this foot represents you as an American. And then the other foot, I say, and now we're going to give you your Jewish identity, your Jewish name as well. And then I quote what's called a drash, a midrash, that compendium of folklore. It's that really is it's stories about the stories in the Bible. So the scene at Mount Sinai and the thunder and the clouds and so on and so forth. And later in the Bible, God's voice at that moment is described as a still small voice that spoke actually in the ear of each person who was there. It wasn't this loud booming voice, small voice in the ear of each person. Um, and while the Jewish people were all standing there, the voice came to them and said, listen, if this covenant of ours is going to move forward, I need some collateral. I need some verification that you're going to keep this covenant. And the Jewish people said, well, that's easy. We'll point to our founders, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, and Rachel. And they were wonderful leaders, and they've inspired us. They continue to inspire us all these generations later, and that's our collateral. That's our proof. And the still small voice said, I knew them better than you do, and that's not enough. And so they said, well, how about our current leaders? There's Moses and his brother Aaron and their sister Miriam and Moses' wife Zipporah. Those are fabulous leaders as well. We can prove, by virtue of their wonderful lives, this covenant will move forward. And the voice again said, that's not enough. So instead of looking to the past and looking to the present, they looked to the future, and they said, on the lives of our children, we promise you that this covenant between us will move forward. And the voice said, that indeed is a good covenant for me. And then we start the naming of the child, and say that, the child obviously has an English name, or a secular name, and then we give officially the Hebrew name, that they will be known by this name within the house of Israel. In other words, amongst the Jewish people. It's that identity card, in a sense, that you have, within the Jewish tribe, the Jewish community. And then we ask for blessing. If there is a circumcision, right here we're going to ask for healing as well for the baby. And this is right after the circumcision occurs, right here, when we give the name. It's right after the circumcision occurs, which will be here. And again, it's very, very quick. It really doesn't take long at all. It takes maybe 3 minutes in the whole thing. And we wish the child a good life, so that they will be that they will have a heart receptive always to Torah and to mitzvot, and have a wonderful family life, and so on. And then the final blessing, you recognize this. This is the blessing that the priests gave to the Jewish people in the middle of the desert. The priests once actually addressed God through Moses and said, sometimes the people want a blessing and we don't know what to say. So this is really our oldest blessing. This is, may the Lord bless you and keep you. I've translated it my way. That's what this is. And then the ceremony is over and we wish each other a mazel tov. Good. A modern ceremony takes place afterwards for the mother. Whether she had an easy time getting pregnant or not, this celebrates the birth of the first child, and that she is fertile, which is wonderful. And then there is this ancient ceremony, Pidyon Haben or Bat. In the Orthodox community, it's only going to be the son. This is daughter. Pidyon is a release, really, not redemption. Release of the firstborn son or daughter. That occurs on the 31st day of a child's life. Speaking of, well, I'll talk about that in a second. I was going to tell you about Shabbat. Let me back up to that. If a circumcision, if the 8th day is Shabbat, how can you do a circumcision? You're not supposed to cut anything, right? But because it's on the 8th day, and it's a Torah commandment, you have to do it even on Shabbat. But you're not going to light 2 Shabbat candles symbolically of the Sabbaths that this child will celebrate, because you can't do that on Shabbat, but you have to do the circumcision, even if it's on the 8th day. If it's Orthodox, the mohel, it will be Shabbat observant, so he has to somehow get a room in the area within a Shabbat walking distance and walk to the house. He'll have to spend Shabbat maybe away from his home in order to do that circumcision on that Saturday. So Pidyon Habat occurs 31st day. You may remember that firstborn male children, according to the Torah, were given to be servants in first the tabernacle in the desert and later the temple in Jerusalem. In remembrance of that, there's a redemption. There's a release of that. We actually buy the children out of that responsibility. That would occur in the ancient world as well if they wanted their child to be a doctor or a lawyer, or an artist or a bookkeeper or whatever else. The family would give a donation to the tabernacle or the temple in Jerusalem. We do that now. There is no temple in Jerusalem. Traditionally, Orthodox communities will actually call in a local person in the community who is a descendant of the priests. Somebody with the last name Cohen or Kahan are often descendants of the priests, but not necessarily. It doesn't have to be a name like that. And they'll give a little donation to that person if they need it for themselves. Terrific. If they want to give it to an organization, a worthwhile organization, they'll do that. And we kind of continue that ceremony as well. And then this is actually it's a mitzvah to have food afterwards to celebrate the commandment that was observed. And it's very often bagels and lox and cream cheese and by the way, this is what Jews will often, we're going to fast next Monday on Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. And people often break the fast with breakfast. So that's what we do. Now, I want to take them, okay, let's get back and look at everybody. Good, okay. And we'll stop the share. Okay. So, I want to talk to you a little bit about the 30 days afterwards. You notice that the Pidyon Haben or Pidyon Habat, the release or buying out of responsibility ceremony happened on the 31st day. A child does not, even if you give a child a name on the 8th day, the name doesn't stick until after 30 days. In the ancient world in particular, it was very hard for people to figure out how long gestation really was and when the child would be born. So just in case the name didn't stick until the 31st day. And in fact, if a child dies within 30 days, you're not supposed to use that child's name at the burial. I always have, because it's just too cruel to the parents. I can't do it. But that's the tradition. The tradition is that you don't use the child's name if they die within 30 days. That's, again, the reason why we don't set up the baby's room. But let's talk about another issue, which I know that Jews and Christians do need to talk about. I'm going to talk about my perspective. We can talk about the Christian Lutheran Christian perspective, at another time too. It'd be really interesting to do both together. So, what about an abortion that may or may not need to happen? Let's talk about it that way. Here's where the rabbis get their imagery from. There is a section in the book of Leviticus that talks about, there's a couple of things. If two people are fighting and they bump into a pregnant woman and she spontaneously aborts, the punishment is that they pay a fine to her husband, which I understand the sexism of that and so on and so forth, and it's not pretty, and I don't like it, and we don't have to. But there's another thing that the rabbis notice. They notice that the perpetrators pay a fine. It's not murder. It's not life for life. That's not the punishment. So if a spontaneous abortion happens, they say, well, what if it's an abortion that needs to happen? For the rabbis, it would be an abortion because the woman's life was in danger. The mother, the pregnant woman, was in danger. And the imagery they take is from the section of the Torah that talks about a pursuer, someone who enters your home at night, especially, and you can't see this person. And at some point, they're pursuing after you in the home. Do you have the right, the Torah asks, and the Talmud will ask again later in more detail, to strike out at this person in self-defense? And the answer is yes. Do you have the right to strike so hard that you may kill the person? The answer is yes. What if the lights go on or you see in the morning that the person was a minor? Is that still okay? And the answer is yes. And the imagery is transported into the fetus inside of the womb. That the fetus is because it's just there, endangers the woman's life. It's a pursuer after the woman's life, and is considered such until its body is literally halfway into the world. Once the fetus is halfway into the world, it's then considered a human being, and a more difficult decision may have to be made. But up until that point, the mother's life will always take precedence. Always take precedence. In the ancient world, enabling an abortion when it was necessary to save the mother was not an easy thing. And the rabbis knew that, and they knew what danger what danger could arise, but they made a decision that a life is a life that we know, that we can see, and is recognizable. That's why they wanted the fetus turns into a baby when it's halfway out. They will always still refer to it as a fetus during that, up until that point. And will always, even if she pleads, to take her life and save the baby, they don't do that. They can see this woman, she is there, she's in distress. The child is deemed a pursuer, or the fetus is deemed a pursuer, because giving birth to this child or having this child in her body is literally endangering her. It's not a child yet, forgive me. The fetus is in there, this little thing is in there, and we always go with the mom. Okay. So I'm sorry to end on a sadder note, but I think that was an important part to mention. So, okay. Got some questions, some comments?
We should talk about the Christian versus Jewish view sometime. I mean,
yeah, we should.
I think Neil, there isn't a Christian view, because there's a variety of Christian views. I can quickly tell you what the Lutheran view is.
Great.
And the ELCA Lutheran view is that abortion is an option of last resort. Mm. That statement, and there's a lot more to the statement, but that statement made the very conservatives and the very liberals uncomfortable. So probably that's a fairly good statement.
Yeah, I think so. I think
last resort, but that means it should be legal, but it should be discouraged. And so that's where the Lutheran Church stands. It doesn't mean that every Lutheran or every Jew feels the same way, as we well know.
Right, absolutely. But the rabbis never talked about it as a late form of birth control or something like that. They never did that. They were talking about you know, if they use that imagery of pursuit, you know, it's basically the same thing. It's not your first resort; it's your last resort.
Yeah. There's so many similarities between birth traditions, as you know, Christian and Jewish. I mean,
isn't it great?
You know, they're very, very similar, including the double ceremony of baptism and christening. You know, it's very, very similar. We've lost some of those distinctions, you know, to our sadness in one sense, because they're cool distinctions, but they still do exist in the Christian church.
Well, I mean, I think that, but is it the same thing that I was mentioning before? Does it sort of take a neutral human being and turn it into a member of the church?
Baptism makes you a member of the church. Christening gives you the name, so it's very similar.
Right. But the thing is
we use the words interchangeably, and they're not.
Right. So essentially, it's like a conversion ceremony, though, too.
It is, and you know, for us, because we believe in infant, it's about grace of God, love of God, God to us. As you know, there are lots of Christians that practice what they call adult baptism, which isn't really adult. It's usually teenager, tweenager, 9, 10, 11.
A tweenager.
Okay. Tweenager, whatever you call it, a tween. You know, but we practice infant baptism to show in the helplessness of the infant the very love of God that would even love and save this infant who doesn't even know what's going on. And so I like that theology a lot. Obviously, I'm invested in it, but that's the theology. But other Christians have a different theology on that baptism is more like confirmation, more like bar mitzvah, accepting those responsibilities on your own.
Interesting.
They might still have confirmation later too, but it would be much more kind of putting the two together.
Yeah, I you know, and it, you know, it's true. You can't, even before, even tweens, you know, when kids become bar mitzvah, I can see their ideas popping, and you know, I ask them in the process. I ask them some very, very difficult questions for which there are no right answers. And you know, give them some examples from Jewish tradition and so on and so forth. But I, you know, start to get them thinking, and then you see them like 3 years later when in our tradition we do a confirmation, and it's so much different.
So what is the? I know we're going to talk about this in another class. What is the recommended age for bar and bas mitzvah?
Oh, it's kind of fixed. It's 13.
13.
In the. But that goes to a tradition that comes from the Orthodox, at which they set male adulthood at 13 and female adulthood at 12. But there are no one becomes a bat mitzvah in the Orthodox community. That's reserved for the liberal communities. They never did that.
They never did that?
They don't do it. Oh, there's some more liberal Orthodox synagogues will do a bat mitzvah. I mean, they'll do a bar mitzvah.
Oh, it's just they don't do women. I see.
They don't do women. They might have, you know, because the woman can't come up and read from the Torah.
True.
She's not allowed to. So, but sometimes they'll have her read from the Bible in English, and they'll do it on a Monday or a Thursday or something, but not on Shabbat. You know, so.
All right. So,
any questions about having a baby?
Well, I can step in here for Pastor Schaefer, and from the Anglican viewpoint also, is that for us, when a child is baptized, he is brought into God's church. And the Anglicans look at it as all Christians, just not Anglicans, because we consider you as Lutherans part of our church.
That's correct.
You know, the Church Universal.
You know, and we Episcopalians, Anglicans, and Lutherans would say that even the person that decides to be a Baptist later does not get rebaptized. They may they may do that, but it's one baptism for forever per person, even if they change their brand of Christianity.
Exactly correct. Yes, because I was not originally raised Anglican or Episcopalian. Right. The other thing with it is that, to clarify, I know that as far as the 8th day for the circumcision is, and the 31 days for the naming. Now, what if that 31st day happens to fall on the Sabbath or Shabbat? Do they have the naming ceremony on Shabbat or not?
Yeah, that's not as fixed. They probably would not.
Okay.
Yeah. And yeah, look, sometimes, for instance, taking the place of what would happen in an Orthodox synagogue with grandpa coming up and getting that special blessing, saying the blessing for the Torah and so on and so forth, and getting a blessing for his granddaughter. We will have people come up on a Friday night up to the pulpit, and I will do the naming ceremony there. So there's different ways that we can do it. We can do it in front of the community, or they can do it just in front of their family and friends. So,
okay. But the circumcision is always done in a home, or is it done in the synagogue sometimes?
It used to be. Sometimes I think it still is done in the synagogue in the Orthodox community, never in the Reform community. It's either going to be at home, the hospital, doctor's office, something like that.
And are there exceptions allowed?
As to where?
As to doing it?
Oh, at all?
At all.
Yes. If the baby, I can't remember what the name for that bleeding condition is, where people don't clot very well.
Hemophilia.
Hemophilia. Thank you. If they're hemophiliac, you can't have a circumcision. If there's hemophilia in the family, you can't have a circumcision. But of course, if you're the first one, then and that's why our doctor, who did the circumcision, with my rabbi standing by putting in all the blessings at that time for my son, that's why he wanted it done in his office, which was on, let's see, it's 10th Street Pediatric. It's on Broadway and 10th. And that's not too far from Santa Monica, UCLA. So that's why he wanted that.
So if a 40-year-old man comes to you on conversion, who isn't circumcised, must he be circumcised to convert?
Some rabbis will require it. Look, many adult males in America are circumcised anyway. And they will take a drop of blood. They will take a drop of blood in the case that the person is already medicinally circumcised. But I leave it as an option. Most of my colleagues, even Reform colleagues, require it. By the time you're a 40-year-old male, that's like major surgery. And it's under anesthesia and so on and so forth. And so the rabbi has to be in there saying the blessings while all this is occurring and so on and so forth. It's not the same, but I have had people say, I really want to do this. I mean, it means something to them. And like I said, they are split about efficacy for the male, for the man, as to whether or not circumcision is beneficial. There is good evidence that it protects the man's future female partners from uterine cancer. But other than that, there's really, every Moyle who I know who was a physician, one of them in particular, would kind of examine the foreskin and say, you see, this one would need to happen because there's adhesions in there. There was always some reason why they thought it should happen, but that's not, traditionally, that's not why you do it. You do it because the Torah says so.
Right.
Yeah. Because they didn't know anything about adhesions or uterine cancer or anything like that. So,
all right, you want to do some wrap up words here, Neil?
Yeah, I do. Birth is a wonderful, wonderful mystery. I don't know any doctor who ever gets robotic about helping women give birth. And certainly you can't convince any parent that their child isn't a miracle, even though we know pretty much exactly what happens. But the Jewish ceremony to welcome a child, just like the Lutheran ceremony, the Anglican ceremony, or a Muslim ceremony, or Hindu ceremony, what they do is they sort of concretize that miracle. and make it accessible to us and symbolically, literally put it in our hands.
There it is. All right.
Odavo shalom aleinu, Odavo shalom aleinu, Yavo shalom aleinu ve'al kulam.